If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode is Dr. Aaron Winter, a senior lecturer in criminology and criminal justice at the University of East London. Aaron, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Great. I gave you a little bit of an introduction there, but did you want to say a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm as you mentioned, I'm a criminologist, although I am also a sociologist. I think we'll sort of probably discuss that journey. I teach at University of East London. So my research is on racism, predominantly, with a focus on the far right, racist violence, including terrorism, but also the relationship between the far right and mainstream structural or systemic racism, and the way these can be used often to offset one another. In addition to looking at racist terror, I'm also quite interested in the way in which counter-terror and counter-extremist discourses by states and in media deal with the issue of race. And that includes scholarship on the topic. The way it can often look at the far right as the sole site of racism, only in its most extreme traditional or illiberal forms, but also the way in which these same discourses can legitimize racism in the way in which they label and deal with terrorism that they associate with Muslims and Islam.
Excellent. Thank you. And we'll get into a little bit more about your research in a moment. Where did your sociology journey start, Aaron?
Well, it's a very long journey, and it comes out somewhere near the end, which is something I sort of probably should have a little more, or I probably do, a little imposter syndrome. I would preface it by saying that I've always been interested in social issues, and particularly racism and anti-racism from a very, very early age. But when I went to study, I did my undergraduate at York University in Canada, I decided that my topic was political, and so I should take political science. And as I found myself studying the Canadian parliamentary system and sort of the great white male European philosophers and political theorists, I started to see something sort of wrong with what I was. This was back in the early 90s. But I also found that political science looked at both the state and civil society in institutional forms as the sort of mediators of democracy and the sort of regulators or measure of progress, them and the law. And people and social formations, social relations seem to be, I guess, more about public opinion, electoral opportunities, electoral constituencies. And I didn't feel that enough was being focused on social inequalities and social relations and the way these reproduce each other. I moved sort of to a minor in humanities where I took courses on the Holocaust, Latin American and Caribbean religion and politics, which is from the Research Center, Sirlac at York. And I started to read Fanon, Said, Baba, and other such works. And while I had originally at that point decided I wanted to move to sociology, I thought, well, this was something that sort of politics and philosophy could still engage with. And I went on to do a master's in philosophy and social theory at University of Warwick. That was a bit of an awakening because still I didn't necessarily find I was dealing with the issues I wanted to. And I was sort of caught between the sort of Deleuzians and the analytic philosophers and the social theorists of modernity.
Yeah.
So to make a very long story short, I then decided to move, when I did my PhD at Sussex, into sort of social and political thought, but out of the sociology department.
Yeah.
And it was also at that time I realized I was probably more an empirical researcher than a theorist. And I taught sociology at Sussex as a PhD student. And I then got my first job at University of Abertay in Scotland as a sociologist in 2008, which is when I also joined the BSA and decided that I had to become a sociologist effectively. So, and then I moved quickly on to becoming a criminologist, my next job. So I'm not sure if I skipped over it. I still count as one.
Yeah. And I'm interested on that empirical research, which we'll come back to as well. But before we do that, I always ask people who their inspirations were. Was there any particular writers or theorists that really inspired you?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, a lot to mention. I mean, some of the inspirations were also the people who taught me and my sort of fellow students, and now the students I teach, and the conversations we had in class and in the pub or coffee shop around class. But I think things really changed in my undergraduate when I read Foucault and Said. And I mean, for a whole host of reasons, the way I was able to understand power and inequality as historical processes and implicating culture, and implicating the very ideas that when I started in sort of political philosophy, we were supposed to worship. And I felt that was really important. Other ones, when I started teaching in this country about race and racism in sociology, John Solomos's work, Paul Gilroy's, Lola Young's. In terms of race, also Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Satnam Virdi's, and particularly this is quite important to me these days, his Racism, Class, and the Racialized Outsider, in the way in which we understand the relationship between race and class in terms of both racism and anti-racism. Anna Marie Smith, my work on the far right, Jesse Daniels, Abby Ferber, Chip Burley, Imogen Tyler. I sort of I have a long list of people who inspired, I mean, different parts. I mean, some have inspired my work about and influenced my work on the far right, some on inequality, some on the relationship between race and class. And I know these are all intertwined, but, and some educating me at certain junctures in my life when I was moving to a different country and I wanted to sort of learn everything I could. And I mean, I remember that process very well, moving from Canada, studying American racism and having to teach racism in Britain, being in Britain and about it, and wider sociology. And I sort of found these authors, these scholars who also presented interventions into a lot of the sort of interventions into, I guess, often the absences, highlighting things that hadn't been engaged with in traditional sociology.
Excellent. I love that's a great list. I suppose as well, the fact that you've been through philosophy and criminology and sociology means that you've got such a wide knowledge of different people that have inspired you.
You know, it's interesting because it's both wide and it produces gaps as well.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting because I know we've gone through various phases within British sort of academia about interdisciplinarity and whether it's a good thing, it's a bad thing, whether the ref erases it, how we deal with it. And in some ways, I feel like my background is or multidisciplinary. And the work I'm doing today, particularly the work with Aurélien Mondon, is very much multidisciplinary. And we're both, I'm a sociologist, he's in politics, which is also where I started. And we both have an interest in both racism and the media. And so I think it also helps if you have knowledge from different disciplines, you also work with people who bring different things to the table.
So let's talk about your research in a bit more detail then. So before we talk about the ins and outs of it, you said you consider yourself an empirical researcher. So how does research look for you, Aaron? What's your methodologies, if you like?
Well, I would just note that I did 3 degrees in theory, political theory, philosophy and social theory, and then social political thought. And then I decided halfway through my PhD that I'm an empirical researcher. So I've since returned to theory a bit, but particularly sort of ideology and discourse analysis. Methodologically, most of my I guess I'll start with my PhD. My PhD was mostly historical research, policy analysis, and documentary analysis, but I dealt a lot with ephemera. So I was looking at the development of the American far right post-civil rights. So a lot of the work by academics focused on the pre-civil rights era and it was historical in nature. Most far right studies at the time dealt with far right parties. That was sort of academic work. And in the US, you didn't have a party. I mean, you had shifts to the right, further right, by the Republicans and by sort of third parties. But you didn't have a party that had sort of electoral hopes that was far right or fascistic. Often what we now euphemistically call populist, which is something we can talk about. But I wanted to look at that sort of, that not necessarily the contemporary period, but that the period of transition from being a mainstream system and state supportive far right of the Klan, National States' Rights Party, to a sort of, the far right went into a Nazification, paramilitarization period where they took up arms, moved to the Pacific Northwest and waited for a race war when they weren't trying to instigate it. And I decided to look at the transition of their discourses, their strategies, and their sort of narratives by looking at their ephemera and their newsletters, their magazines, their manifestos from the civil rights period to from between the 70s and the 90s. So it was a lot of archive research, a lot of close readings of extremely sort of violent, racist, anti-Semitic material, and analyzing the discursive and narrative shifts. It also involves some interviews, not with far-right actors, but with some monitoring groups and some experts and activists.
Thank you. And let's move on to your work on right-wing extremism then. What's your research found in terms of how it arises, why does it creep up or drop down again? I know that's a very broad question, but I thought it would be a good starting point to try and understand it.
Yeah, I'm not, I guess this is a tricky one because I hesitate to say I'm not trying to explain it, whereas that the explanatory function of academic work and sociology is very important. I'm not trying to say, so in far right studies, the explanation, causal explanation is often linked to theories about how we stop it. And these are intimately linked. These are two sides of the same coin. And they actually produce one another. And so you have a lot of work on radicalization and de-radicalization. And I'm not looking at, so how do I contextualize this? I'm not looking to de-radicalize anyone. I'm not trying to stop the flow of membership recruitment. And that's not like I think it should continue. It's just not what my work is focused on. I'm much more interested in the way both the far extreme right, and I'm talking about these differences, mobilize and articulate their racism at certain points historically and in certain ways, but also how they can be influenced by the mainstream. And by that, I mean two things. One in which they can be legitimized, platformed, and mainstreamed. But the other is that they can be displaced, demonized, and delegitimized in ways in which the state then, in comparison, or the mainstream, gets to have their moderate version of immigration control and concerns about Islam and opposition to Black Lives Matter and opposition to a whole host of policies in ways that construct the far right as the real evil, the real site of racism, and the mainstream's moderate versions of this as a bulwark against them. And I think you see both of those historically. I think you've seen in America, which is quite interesting, there's this idea that with civil rights, we got rid of the Klan. We got rid of that horrible racism. Now, of course, it's back, and it didn't really totally go away, but it's no longer mainstream. So what they end up doing is constructing this demon from history as a threat to mainstream liberal democracy and progress, not acknowledging how intimately connected to the mainstream it is and how much racism continued on a structural and systemic level, even without them. Whereas here in Britain, you often find, particularly from sort of the right and libertarians and some liberals, this idea that racism isn't a problem in this country because it's not like the National Front is still walking through city centers. Now, then you get into a discussion about the EDL walking through city centers, or you get other questions about the far right. Well, no, they're an insignificance. But they're saying this in the context of not only hostile environment, go home vans, but increasingly allowing the far right into mainstream discussions and their ideas gaining legitimacy in terms of, for example, migration or the refugee crisis. And so the far right becomes this demon that you say, but for progress, we would have it worse. And me and Aurelian Mondon look at this in reactionary democracy in some of our other work, and I've done it about the US in some of my other writings. But the way in which the far right isn't just a reality, it also has a function within discourse. And I guess the other function I would say, one of the examples, returning to the issue of violence, one of the major criticisms of Prevent, one of them, has been the disproportionate targeting and impact on Muslim community. And while the far right sort of grew and grew and grew and became increasingly mainstream, you can have an idea that discussions about certain things by Muslims is unacceptable in schools and in universities, but you also have an increasing pressure to have, to use the far right as a test whether we have freedom of speech or cancel culture. But the idea that the response to the criticism of Prevent, that it was racist, there was a double standard and disproportionately targeted Muslims, was to say, well, now that the far right's a problem, we're going to look at them too. And now we have equality. Well, the problem with that kind of equality, or that equivalence, is that no, they're not two sides of the same coin. And actually, the security service and counter-extremist discourse and counter-terrorist discourse has also been shared within the mainstream public discourse and media discourse and been legitimizing far-right concerns. And so you see the mainstreaming of far-right concerns, and then the state will turn on that in order to distance itself or to superficially appease criticism.
Yeah. So just getting my head around this, maybe I should have asked this first before I asked that question.
I went on a bit. Yeah.
Well, no, because I was just thinking, where do you define the line between, for example, right of centre, right wing, and far right? Let's take, what's the difference between being right wing and being far right?
Well, I mean, look, I guess there's two levels to look at it. One is a discourse. One is the way things are spoken about in political discussion. So you can have an idea of a center within a context of the spectrum moving further to the right. So these are all contingent terms. These are all relative terms, and these are terms depending on how they're articulated within political discussions. So I'm very careful not to say that something is defined away and it's fixed. One of the arguments that we make in our research is that we've had a mainstreaming of the far right. This doesn't mean necessarily that the far right, these are or sort of far right parties and ideas that are anti-immigrant, racist, are allowed into the system or running for office. It can mean their ideas. So if you have street activists, if you have street activists calling for repatriation of immigrants, that's far right or extreme right. It can be extreme right. Oftentimes far right are the parties that use slightly more moderate language and don't advocate violence. And there's another discussion whether the state racism is also state violence. And so one of the interesting things is extreme right is usually racist movements who advocate or participate in violence. So then how do you look at that? And call for repatriation? How do you understand that as extremist when you're also looking at a state rounding people up, deporting them, and causing symbolic and sort of physical violence to people based on the fact that they're the moderate voices there? We also know, if you look on the left as well, the construction of something as extreme, like Corbynism, can end up leading to support for, or the belief that someone more centrist can have electoral success. and what centrism means to that when you've constructed a far left. Doesn't necessarily mean something slightly less far left.
Yes.
It also means something that appeases the right more. One of the discussions we often get in is how do you label UKIP? And often the defenses of UKIP are, we're not far right because we're not the National Front. And, we have legitimate ideas. We're saying things that the people want to hear. Well, everyone's a Democrat if they can cite public opinion. Doesn't matter how much that public opinion may be based around having a bad sample size, can be partial, can be completely made up, or can be asking certain questions in a sort of agenda setting way. If you keep on asking people, are you worried about immigration? Are you worried about immigration? No, don't look at all the tabloid headlines and So UKIP may have had their ideas were mainstreamed, but their electoral successes weren't. They didn't have mainstream. So this makes it very difficult to say this belongs here, and this belongs there. And one of the reasons, and I may be a bit evasive on this, was because in far right studies, definitions are like paramount. And terrorism studies too, terrorism, everyone's defining it again and again. But one of the things that me and Aurelian talk about is sort of the way in which these definitions are often based on taxonomies. They're based on fixed positions in a sort of a stable graph of who's right and who's left.
Yes.
And we've seen, things have changed. Things have changed partly because the discourse has changed. Parties have realigned. There's been multiple sort of economic and political crises. But I think one of the things that's interesting to note, and what we're focusing a little more on our current work about this, is that you always have this idea that whatever it is out there that may be called far extreme is a threat to the mainstream or a threat to democracy. And that becomes quite interesting when you talk about Brexit or Trumpism, and you go, well, we have to fight this or we have to accept it because it speaks for the people. And in a sense, it's often the assertion of a liberal consensus at the time, a contingent liberal consensus, or even a conservative contingent consensus. But the idea that something can be, I guess populism is the interesting one to talk about because it's this, oftentimes it's a euphemism for the far right or racism. And sometimes it's posed as a threat. Sometimes it's a term used for what would be defined as almost a democratic insurgency of the people's will against the establishment. That becomes quite difficult when you try sort of, I guess in a sense, that's the recipe for mainstreaming some of the ideas. I mean, there's a famous sort of interview with Hillary Clinton where she said, if we don't deal with immigration, you're going to let the extreme right get in. And I guess it's like, what are you so afraid of the extreme right if you want their ideas to get in so they don't come to power? Well, then effectively you want power. And that becomes something that I don't think enough people have really engaged with when they're trying to understand the way in which public opinion is weaponized and the way in which the left behind are constructed.
Yes.
And I would say it's like the way the sort of the demographic that parties, and I would say this because there's all that debate about the red wall and everything here, the way in which you say, this is the constituency that matters, and I accept all the narratives that have been written about this constituency, and so every party is going to move a little bit to the right on immigration. And that's when you have a mainstream right get a little further right. You have a left move to the center or to the center right. You remember Miliband's control immigration mugs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you've said the word a few times now about populist. I'm just trying to get my head around that, because if something becomes populist, does that mean it's then not extreme? Because something can't be right-wing extreme if it's then become populist, can it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a difficult one because, I mean, and this is usually where it'd be a good idea to have my sort of co-author here. We could discuss it because we sort of problematize it quite a bit in our work, but it's become it means a lot of things, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So in a sense, it can often be a euphemism for more extreme or illiberal ideas, what would be considered illiberal. But it's one that's attached to, because of narratives and discourses that are produced within campaigns and by the media or within our own analysis, as the will of the people. And oftentimes that's because the rhetoric of these parties or actors sort of reifies and reproduces that, as opposed to it being real. And then you say it's populist, and you start to legitimize those ideas as democratic, as the will of the people, and as legitimate concerns. And we see a lot of work in political science about this as well, about claiming this is how people feel, this is what they want. And there's not a discussion about how the questions are asked, or about agenda setting, about whether that's acceptable or that's a good enough reason to sacrifice the people on the sharp end of that. But it can also be a term for things which are extreme and insurgent and anti-establishment. And in that sense, you also get scholarship and sort of media analysis that treats left-wing and right-wing movements both as populist, whereas it is important to note, particularly because we've attached this idea of the left behind to Trumpism and Brexit, that if you're going to do a proper sociology of this, of socioeconomic and political inequality and disenfranchisement, what those left-wing movements are offering in terms of structural change is quite different, and I would argue more sociologically sound, whether you agree or not with the party's politics. It's not scapegoating, displacement, and demonization. And I think you don't have to like those parties, but I'm just saying they're not part, it's not part of the same phenomenon. It also means what you do is, if you see parties and media on the right saying all these are populist, demonizing the right populists and demonizing the left populists, but still having positions which mainstream the ideas of the right-wing populists in order to foreclose on their threat electorally, you end up having an imbalance in that system. That discourse allows for, so populism as something we need to engage with or we need to fend off can both produce a reproduction or a reaffirmation of establishment status quo. And I think we see this often. We're like, immigrants, there's agenda setting with the immigrant and refugee crisis and racism, but there's also a way in which this has been very, very good for establishment politics that doesn't have to disentangle or deal with the damage done by austerity, particularly which is, coming home to roost with COVID-19. And, of course, there's for Farage, and I think a lot of the media would use different language but make the same argument. And it's really interesting because we all, gasped in horror when we talked during the early days of COVID, where everyone's talking about, herd immunity and the eugenicist arguments, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, I would have thought that would have been a wake-up call, because from 2010 on, anyone who was poor and in need of state support and a social safety net was hung out to dry. So then, some of the people who are in need get to be members of this national community, often in a racialized way, if immigrants can be scapegoated. And, I think the COVID-19 should have been a wake-up call that actually the working class are in this together and at the sharp end, the very diverse working class. But instead it becomes again about save the economy, which doesn't serve everyone equally, and look over there, refugees. Yeah, I think that's, and it plays on, I think it plays often on this, the populist or the rhetoric that's related to the sort of the concept and analysis of populism and tactic of public opinion, what the people want. I mean, a lot of people may want a basic living wage. They may want a well-resourced NHS. They may want a works program. They may want a lot of things. But the only thing that the only people that sort of the government seems to care about is, but they want controls over immigration.
let's talk a little bit more about that. So reactionary democracy, how racism and the populist right became mainstream. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about how that got started, how you conducted your research on that one?
Absolutely. I should have normally when we describe this, it's a two-person co-author kind of thing. So I'll try to do justice to it. Yeah, I mean, I think we're looking at many of the things I've said already, and after years of working mostly on sort of the far or extreme right, I've sort of moved more to, I guess, similar to areas that I'm teaching, is on sort of mainstream structural institutional racism. But in it, we look at the place of, the title sort of says it, how racism, populist, far right became mainstream. We're looking at the notion of reactionary democracy, which is the construction and often weaponization of democracy for reactionary ends. So we're looking very much at the way in which democracy is evoked in the service of, through I guess, the people's will or discourses about populism, about immigration control, white victimization, reverse racism, and a whole bunch of other things. But part of what this is premised on is an idea about whether racism is legitimate. And we look at the way in which democracy become and liberalism, and I'll say a little something with that, are ways of legitimizing racism as discourses. The way in which, if you couch it in these terms, the people's will, democracy, sort of, it becomes something that is not necessarily is something we ought to do, or that is acceptable. And part of this is premised on the what we call the liberal and illiberal racism sort of distinction. And this is the idea that racism used to be an acceptable, legitimate thing. It used to be an illiberal scourge on our liberal democratic societies. But in the European case, we defeated the Nazis, those horrible racist imperialists. And then we had a half century of progress in liberal democracy. In America, slightly delayed till civil rights, deterioration in civil rights. In South Africa, till the end of apartheid. And you have this idea that we have progressed, we have overcome these. Now, it's quite interesting because then the far right becomes this remnant of the past, something that is out of time, out of place, and doesn't belong, and we all hate it. And this is a way in which Western societies have convinced themselves. And we also, in the book, we talk about the US, UK, and France. We touch on some other countries as well. But the way in which liberal societies have convinced themselves that they are not superior because they're white, they're superior because they're liberal and tolerant, much more so than other people and places. And so you see the racism form in other ways. But there is this sort of like value democracy, this value liberalism that increasingly can become weaponized in new forms of racism. Some call them neo-racism, cultural racism, colorblind racism.
Yeah.
And they're weaponized against certain groups in the name of liberal values. So we wrote an article in Ethnic and Racial Studies on liberal and illiberal Islamophobia, and the way in which free speech, women's rights, LGBT rights are weaponized against false versions of them are weaponized against Muslims. But also the way, and the free speech one is a continuing discussion. I've just seen another celebrity who has a recording deal has just damned cancel culture. But the way in which these have been weaponized against certain groups, but also the way in which they've been weaponized against anti-racist politics. So in a sort of colorblind frame, if you talk about racism and racial inequality, you're making race the issue. And there's different discourses about that. You're not appreciating how far this society's come and how good we are to you. Or you're saying that race is the most important thing to you, and you've got the problem. And you see this on a lot of libertarian right sort of writing and discourses. But the liberal racism is the one that is seen as having democratic virtues. It is colorblind. It is giving everyone freedom, all these kind of things. And then you have, I think there's a sort of a slight move before you get to the mainstreaming part, is the idea that now all things are equal. They, can do it to them. Right. And so what you have, Mary Song is sort of like a culture of racial equivalence.
Yes.
And this idea that, well, if we accept that everyone's equal, you acknowledge this as a problem, then you're not, then you're raising the issue. You're making it issue and you want more. I mean, it's an age-old anti-affirmative action discourse. But if all things are equal, reverse racism becomes an issue or a possibility. And what we see in the populist discourse is not just a rearticulation of democracy in terms of the will of a specific discourse about both the people and the nation. So what the people want, but what the people seem to want is going back on all the progress, which is the key to not having to acknowledge it, which is ironic. It's where you get nostalgia for previous periods, even for empire, that despite all the progress. Yeah. And the defense of statues of slave traders. But what ends up happening there is that in between these two moves, who the people are, who are constructed as the people in this will of the people, are in the dominant narratives, the left behind. And these are the white working class. Now, some people say, well, it's not just the white working class, it's the working class. Although you often find the discourses are always about how the working class is worried about immigration, despite that the diversity of the working class would include immigrants and, first, second, third generation immigrants, or descendants of immigrants. But also, it allows, the construction of the white working class allows for a construction of whiteness that no longer has privilege. It allows for the cementing on often pseudo-sociological terms of a victimization of a certain group. Now, there is no doubt working class people are disenfranchised, and particularly in an unequal system, in a class system. But the way it argues is that this is the will of the people, this is the voice of the people, and those who are immigrants, racial and ethnic minorities, are not given a class position within this and are often at the sharp end of its politics. What it also ignores is this is often an elite project where what the will of the people is also intimately connected with what the right wants, the establishment right wants, but also in terms of immigration, or thinks they can justify as an appeal to the working class, addressing their historical failure on inequalities and regulating capitalism. But also, if you construct the white working class as the engine of, or the source of racist anti-immigrant politics, that's a totally classed analysis. It's extremely like, I mean, it's if it wasn't for the whiteness, but it also benefits elites. It benefits white people in general, or it claims to. It ends with the Tory party running process as opposed to a populist insurgent party. It ends with a millionaire Republican running things over there. And not only no structural adjustments to the socioeconomic system, it ends with actually the crisis after crisis where the holes in the system that would produce socioeconomic inequality and disenfranchisement are maintained and reproduced. And so I think one of the things, and I sort of veered off a little bit, but I think the argument we're partly making is the way in which the discourse of populism and democracy often use them and use certain figures within society as scapegoats or justifications to perpetuate reactionary agendas under the auspices of democracy.
So I'm just trying to work out where the intersectionality of race comes into class, because is ultimately the majority of this to do with class and race is a sub issue, or I'm just trying to get my head around it. If ultimately this is a class discussion.
If I was to make a choice, I think this is ultimately a race discussion. I think that ultimately what has been done is in in many contexts, and this is not talking about voters themselves. This is talking about the narratives, the analysis, including by scholars, and the projects, is you have often, and I'm not just saying racist politics that are justified on class grounds, but they're justified on racist grounds. I mean, the construction of the left behind is a racial construction. It's not a class construction. If it's about white people. Yeah. And it's about nostalgia for empire, and it's about nostalgia for a period prior to Windrush. That's a racial project, not a class project. If you're talking about a construction of class where race is second, where we know the class status of immigrants, Black people, the idea of separating race and class only serves to oppose them, to construct an opposition to them. So if you're making if someone's making an argument that how do class and race intertwine, and they're saying that, class is, fundamental and race is class reified, then they'd have a lot to explain about the way in which the working class is weaponized against Black, immigrant, Asian people and communities. You'd also have to disentangle the relationship between empire, slavery, immigration, and capitalism. Yes, I think one of the problems is, and I think we see this with labor as well. It's like going, well, we need to appeal to the red wall. We need to appeal, we need to appeal to their concerns. Well, who are they? And are they a class cohort? Or are they a white cohort? Yeah. And what do you think they believe? Do you think because they're working class, they're racist? Or do you think because they're white, they're racist? Or do you think that there might be a diversity? It's interesting. The right has all the time for this diversity of ideas thing, except when it comes to working class. Then they all think alike. And you can see this. Look, much of the literature on the left behind has been written by elite scholars claiming working class people believe something and pursuing their own racist and xenophobic agendas. It's difficult because the way in which the sociology of class and the sociology of race are constructed in the sociological kind of community, it's that they're different. They don't talk to one another. Yeah. And largely I would say, though, there's some great scholars of class who work on race. There are a lot. I can't think of any sociologist. Most scholars of sociologists of race deal with class. Satnam Virdi's work, for example, racism, class, and the racialized outsider. These are not opposed. The history of Black Marxism. Yeah, I don't think these are separate, and I think the separate is artificial and serves a racist agenda, not always intentionally. Yeah,
that makes sense. Thanks, Aaron. That was a really interesting and passionate explanation. Sorry. No, that's exactly what I think the listeners want to hear as well.
One of the things is I find it's not intentional, but it's when you're sitting in your own home. Yeah, it's probably a more relaxing environment. You're like, a little too comfortable. Yeah.
Thank you, Aaron. We're slowly running out of time, so I just wanted to ask you if people want to read more about your work or the book that we mentioned, or Twitter. Where can they learn more about you?
I'm on Twitter at Aaron Z. Winter, but I'm taking a break right now.
I noticed that yesterday.
It's been excellent. It's been excellent. Yeah, we've got Reactionary Democracy, published by Verso, by Aurelian Mondana and myself. We have an article, Articulations of Islamophobia, in Ethnic and Racial Studies, and one on whiteness, populism and the racialization, the working class in the US and UK in identities, as part of our sort of great special issue on whiteness and nationalism, edited by Nasser Mir. And I have a number of other pieces out on the history of the Ku Klux Klan in relation to counterterrorism and online hate. And you can check anything out. And I also recommend you pursue some of the authors that I've mentioned if you haven't already. And I only wish I could have got more names in.
Thank you very much for your time today, Aaron. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you.
If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.